Hello, welcome along to the Fun Kids Science Weekly. My name's Dan. Thank you very much for listening. This week, we've got something a little bit different. It's a pandemic pathology special with support from the Royal College of Pathology. Now, on the show, you can hear from some genius expert scientists all about what pathology is, how you test illnesses in the lab, and also how disease can move between species. We'll have a game as well to see how much you know about your science from the last year. And we'll have something to cheer you up for this week's Science in the News. That's on a little bit later. Now, learning about pandemic pathology is extremely important this year because a pandemic is a disease which can spread across the whole world, and it's done that in 2020. Back in March, the World Health Organization declared a pandemic of cases of COVID-19. Now, in the first half of the year, the virus is thought to have affected over 40 million people. You probably had to stay at home because schools and shops were shut all over the place. You couldn't really go to clubs or cinemas. You might not even be able to do that now. You probably haven't been able to see your whole family normally for ages. That's what we're talking about today, and about how pathologists can help us try and find the solution to the problem. We talk about why it happened and how it's affected everyone differently. Listen to this. Here's how the pandemic has affected some of you.
I'm Joe and I'm 10 years old. Lockdown for me has been quite weird of a time. I haven't been able to see my friends. It's been a little bit scary and made me really lazy. I've liked being able to play one of my favourite games, which is Minecraft. And when I got back to school, I was actually really happy, which is unlikely considering it was school.
Hi, I'm Eliza. I'm 9 years old, and what I didn't like about lockdown was that we were all in the house together. So my mum, my dad, me and my brother, and that I couldn't see my friends, which was very sad. What I liked about lockdown was that I got to be homeschooled and my mum was teaching me, so we could do things that I wanted to do, like crafts and science experiments, and not just things that we had to do. In the future, I want the schools to stay open.
My name is Miles and I'm 5 years old, and I didn't like lockdown because we couldn't go to my friend's house. I miss seeing Daisy, Scott and all my friends. My favourite thing was we could still go to the skate park. We used to go with Daddy a lot and we did climb up the skates thingy, and I was very careful and I didn't even get hurt.
Now, we've spoken about pathology before on the show. It's medical problem solving, looking for evidence, finding out what's happened, what's happening to our bodies and why that's happening, and how different pathologists look at different things. You see, some look at blood cells to find the solutions. Others look at organs and tissues. Some check healthy bodies. Some even look at dead ones. They look for clues which might help find evidence of a problem that you didn't even know you had. Now, to find out more about what pathologists do, have a listen to this. It's an episode from one of our brilliant series. It's Professor Halleck's.
Professor Halleck's Pathology Puzzles with the Royal College of Pathologists.
Not Time Stop Crime Cop again?
It's not Time Stop Crime Cop, it's Crime Stop Time Cop. Sorry, no, I mean Time Cop Crime Stop, whatever. He's a daring time-travelling pathologist figuring out how all these dead bodies met their sticky end. What's not to like?
So why does it always have to be about dead people, though? It's so gloomy.
Pathology isn't gloomy, it's fascinating. And it's certainly not always about dead people. In fact, it's most commonly used to diagnose and treat people who are alive. But you're right, the words tend to make us think of detective shows like this.
So this is forensic pathology?
That's right. Nothing to do with paths either.
Yes, I do know that, Professor. So, what do forensic pathologists do and why?
A forensic pathologist is primarily involved in identifying the cause of death and reconstructing the circumstances by which the death occurred. A dead body is called a corpse, and an autopsy, sometimes called a post-mortem examination, is a medical examination of a corpse to find out what killed it.
People die all the time. They must be very busy.
Yes, but autopsies aren't done all the time. They're usually done either for medical reasons or for legal ones. A medical reason may be when doctors aren't sure why a person died, whilst a legal one might be to find out if the death was the result of a crime. Wherever there is a puzzle, that's where you'll find pathology.
So they have to cut up the body and get all the squishy bits out. Ugh. It's all so icky.
Well, sometimes the cause of death can be found by simply looking at the corpse without opening it, like looking for bruising or at a fingernail tissue samples under the microscope to establish the cause of death. But other times, pathologists may need to also examine the internal body organs. Don't worry, if a body is opened, it'll be closed again. Pathologists don't like to make mess, so it's not normally quite as dramatic as Time Cop Crime Stop.
Glad to hear it.
Professor Halleck's Pathology Puzzles with the Royal College of Pathologists. Find out more at funkidslive.com/Hallex.
Pathologists have been really busy this year. They've been at the heart of detecting the virus. They've been helping to contain COVID-19, develop treatments and maybe even cures. This is a disease that we haven't had to manage before. And there are thousands of problems to solve, like where it comes from, how it's moving between people, between communities, even between countries, how you detect it in an infected person, how it affects you, how it also affects other people differently, what medicines, what treatments should be used, whether the tests work, whether they can make vaccines. It's a big list of things that pathologists have had to do. That's why they've been so busy through 2020. It's our pandemic pathology special of the Fun Kids Science Weekly, and to tell us more and to answer a few more questions, we've got Dr. Giuseppe Picchieri on. He is a consultant medical microbiologist, which is an amazing job title. Giuseppe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, as I say, a brilliant title. I think we'll cover how you got that in just a second. I want to know about testing, if that's okay, because everyone's been talking about testing at the moment, how maybe there aren't enough tests available, how the numbers are higher with the pandemic at the moment because more people are being tested. What actually happens in a hospital testing lab, Giuseppe?
Right. What happens usually, for me that I'm in a microbiology lab, we tend to receive lots of samples that tend to be tested in order to try and see whether or not there is a bacteria or a virus causing the infection. We would usually receive different samples, like respiratory samples, like sputum samples, for instance, or we might receive stool samples, like in cases, for instance, a patient has got diarrhea, and we try and find out if we manage to culture them and retrieve the bacteria that is responsible for the infections. We do have molecular testing, for instance, which we can try and detect whether or not we can find DNA or RNA, like molecular material, that will tell us whether or not there is a specific bacterium or virus responsible for the infection. In terms of the COVID-19, the disease caused by SARS coronavirus 2, what we try and do is try and detect part of the genetic material of the RNA of this virus inside respiratory samples. The amount of samples that obviously we have received since the end of January up until now has increased dramatically, and this is increase dramatically the amount of work that we are doing in terms of trying to detect whether or not a specific patient in the hospital or outside of the hospital has got the virus, but has reduced the space for anything else, for all the usual cultures that we do. And obviously this huge increase on the volume of samples is due to the amount of repeat testing that we do for all the patients that are inside the hospital to try and see if they are still testing positive or not.
Now, what does the testing consist of? So when you get a little sample of spit or a sample of poo, something like that, what do you What are you looking for in there, Giuseppe? How do you know, right, in this bit I can see a sign of coronavirus?
Right. In terms of the coronavirus, what we do is an amplification of the genetic material, we call it. So basically, we got our own, the respiratory samples that we take from the patients, the little bit of spit of the samples that we take from the patients, and we run it through a machine. We try and see if there is any genetic material, any pieces of RNA of the coronavirus inside that spit. What do we do is we put inside this machine, which tries and try and see if we can get more of it. By the time it reaches a threshold of this amount of genetic material of this RNA, it will tell us, oh yes, there is coronavirus inside it, or no, there isn't. In terms of how much of it we can get inside, the machine will tell us, depending on how many cycles of amplifications we need to do until we reach that threshold.
Now, there was a lot of talk right at the start when we first began to hear of coronavirus, that it had jumped to humans by bats. Do we know more about that yet, Giuseppe?
We don't quite know for sure whether this has happened. We know that this does happen in nature. I mean, the interaction between human and animal species have existed since the beginning of history, and lots of human diseases are actually due to this interaction between animals and humans. I mean, if we go to the beginning of times, measles, diphtheria, tuberculosis, leprosy, all of them seem to have been originated by this interaction between humans and animals, whether because they were living together, whether because they ended up being in contact between each other. We don't know if this is definitely been the case for coronavirus, but we do know that potentially other coronavirus very similar to the ones that we are studying now, the ones that we are discussing about now, SARS coronavirus 2, have been found in Chinese bats. And what we are trying to investigate now is whether or not this jump has happened, at which point the jump happened, and what caused the coronavirus to then spread between humans rather than relying on the bats to spread between ourselves.
How do you possibly find that moment? How do you go back and pinpoint the moment where this virus may have jumped from a bat to a human? That must be a pretty tough detective work.
It is, but this has happened already in the history for another big outbreak that we had very recently, and I'm sure you all remember the West African Ebola epidemic in 2014. The pinpoint with Ebola was much easier because obviously the disease is much more dramatic, and we don't really have a huge amount of asymptomatics like we have in the context of the COVID-19. But the pinpointing of the transmission led to a 2-year-old boy in Meliandou in Guinea, and the investigation and the epidemiological investigation of a huge team of doctors, anthropologists, led to the discovery, I mean, Meliandou is just a village of 30 houses, led to the discovery of a large tree not far from some of the houses there in Meliandou, where this 2-year-old kid might potentially been playing, and he was known to be playing, and where a huge colony of bats lived there. And the sequences of the Ebola viruses known to have caused the initial cases of Ebola within the humans were potentially the same ones found within the bats.
How do these viruses tend to jump between animals and humans? Is it through the air? Is it through water? Is it through just touching, like petting your cat, petting a bat? What happens there?
It could potentially be a simple contact. It could be a bite. It could be sharing of the same environment, and it could be through feces, through stool. It could be through droplets of respiratory material. There could be a number of different mechanisms. I think the interaction between humans and animals is massive, and the ways that this interaction might potentially cause disease in humans is great. I mean, there are a number of different opportunities through which the viruses can actually jump.
Why, in the mind of a virus, does it want to do this? Is it normally because the virus is being beaten out of its host? Or is it just, hey, this is somewhere new to go, let's jump across?
Good question. Yeah, it could be that. It could be trying to find a new environment. It could just happen because it just happened just by chance, and the virus finds new ways to be replicating. It could be that there was this a single episode initially, and this didn't create a new virus that could potentially spread within humans, but then a number of different casual repetition of the same jump and transmission between humans caused this virus to then become established within humans. This is known to have happened, for instance, for HIV, which was initially a disease of monkeys in Cameroon, in Africa, and through repeated transmission between humans then become established as a human disease.
Now, you are a consultant medical microbiologist. 3 amazing words put together there. Why did you want to study to be in that field, and what's it like working as one?
I must say, going back to when I was a child, I actually didn't really want to become a medical doctor. I was more interested to become a vet. And then slowly I started to become more interested in becoming a medical doctor. And then I always had a strong desire to travel. So I think at some point I tried to put all these 3 things together. And I trained as a medical doctor and as a medical microbiologist in Pisa, in Italy, the city of the Leaning Tower. And then I took a Master of Science in Tropical Medicine. And then I started to travel overseas. I went to lots of different places. I worked in Mozambique, I worked in Ethiopia, I worked in Malawi, I worked in Papua New Guinea. And I think it satisfied these 3 different parts of my personality.
Amazing. Dr. Giuseppe Picchieri, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
Huge thank you to Dr. Giuseppe for coming on the show. You can hear from another scientist in just a sec who will let you know how amazing your body is at protecting you. Before that, should we have a little game? Nice and easy. Just to test how much you know about the science of last year. Play along wherever you're listening to this. All you need to do is figure out whether these are true or false. Here we go. COVID-19 is the most deadly pandemic the world has ever seen. True or false? Well done if you said it's false, or at the least at the moment it's false. It might feel like the worst pandemic the world has ever seen, but the Black Death back in the 14th century killed as many as 200 million people. We spoke about that in detail as one of our very first Dangerous Dans. If you missed that, go back and listen to one of the very first episodes that we did of the Fun Kids Science Weekly. Well done if you got that right. Here's another true or false. What do you reckon? COVID-19 came from someone eating an animal. True or false? It's actually a little bit of a trick question. It's maybe. We found this out from Dr. Giuseppe earlier. Although it is possible for viruses to travel between species, and some think that it's a virus that we share with bats and with pangolins, we may never know for certain where COVID-19 came from. Here's another one, true or false. What do you reckon? A semi-deadly flu is more dangerous than a super deadly one. Do you think it's more dangerous? Weirdly, it is actually true. Peter Doherty, who is a Nobel Prize winner, he said that milder viruses go undetected for longer, which makes them spread more quickly. No one's really focused on the ones that aren't causing trouble right away. And then suddenly it's like a switch has been flicked, and that's when the really dangerous stuff happens with those mildly dangerous viruses. Viruses which kill everyone end up, leaving them with no more hosts, so they quickly die out. And last, true or false, this is a fun one. Viruses come from space. I bet you said false, didn't you? it's a maybe, another little trick one. Viruses are pretty odd, and in some senses they aren't even organisms that are alive, and because there's not much like them on Earth. But some people think they are alien species from space. Maybe these viruses arrived on an asteroid. Now, we don't have any proof about it, so it's hard to say, but not much can really survive in space. It's pretty unlikely, but we don't really know. It's our pandemic pathology special of the Fun Kids Science Weekly. Now, to let us know a little bit more about pathology and the world of that, we've got Dr. Rachel Wheeler on the line. She's a clinical scientist at St George's Hospital. Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Now, let's start right at the very beginning. Open it up for us. What actually is pathology?
Oh, well, there's a starting point. So pathology is a really broad term. In hospitals, there's a whole team of people who can be called pathologists, and it includes loads of scientists and doctors who are doing tests to help the doctors diagnose and treat their patients. So it includes people who are called radiologists, who do all sorts of imaging. They take x-rays, CT scans, MRI scans, looking inside a patient to see what's going on. It includes big teams of scientists and medics working in laboratories, and we are doing tests on blood, on wee, on poo, on spit, you name it, we'll look at it, again trying to get answers for the doctors. And there's also some of the scientists and medics are called histopathologists, and they look at body parts, if it's not too gross, biopsies, so small samples that we've taken from a patient to try and again look at them really closely under a microscope and try and work out what's making the person sick.
Now, you mentioned that you look at wee, poo and spit.
We do.
Can I ask you, in your experience, what's the most interesting of those for a clinical scientist to look at? What tends to, I know this is a question, what tends to give you the most information?
I would say possibly blood, if I'm honest, gives us the best information because it's really what's going on inside. The problem with poo is it's full of all sorts of bacteria that are always breaking things down. So they tend to break things down before we get a chance to look at them. So there's a few things we can look at in there, and the bugs themselves, but that's quite hard. The one I hate analysing the most is spit, because spit smells like whatever that person just ate, and that's a little bit too gross for me.
Now, this is a pandemic pathology special of the show.
Yes.
So, just like I asked you what pathology is, very broadly, what is a pandemic? How do you define it?
Ooh, see, for me, that's really a question for the virologist. But the point of the pandemic is that it's an infection that there's been an outbreak, but it's spreading, and it's spreading across the world. And so for something to be called a pandemic, I know there's strict definitions out there, but broadly it means that it's spreading across the world and affecting multiple countries in a very significant way.
And how can people in your line of work, pathologists and clinical scientists, how can you help in a pandemic? What's your role in trying to make people get better?
So there's a few things that we can do. The immediate stuff that we do is when someone comes into hospital really sick from it, our first question is, what have they got? Is it this thing that's causing the pandemic? So that we can treat them as quickly as possible. So that'll be things like the radiologist will be taking chest x-rays. You may know that this particular coronavirus affects our breathing in particular, and so looking at what the lungs are doing, how badly affected they are, can be a really important piece of information. We take lots of blood samples to look at, we can find in the blood evidence of exactly what bug is making you sick, so we can pick up the coronavirus in the blood. There's teams of virologists, so they're the scientists working in the virology labs, who do a molecular test that can amplify up teeny tiny pieces of the virus's DNA and amplify it up to detectable levels to tell us that it's there. Once we know for sure that it's there, then we know what we're dealing with and we can start treating them. There's other teams in the virology labs and the immunology labs looking at the antibody response. So this is the test that tells you if you've ever been exposed, and it can give us an idea of how many people have had the infection without even knowing about it. And that testing will probably be really important when we start introducing a vaccine. And then that's all the stuff that we do to help the patients that are sick at the moment. But at the same time, all the doctors and scientists are thinking about looking for clues. How can we make these testing faster, quicker, better to try and find sick people quicker? We're also looking for patterns, any clues that will tell us what is it about the virus that is making us so sick. Can we find things that we can measure that would warn us that this particular person is about to get really sick? Because we know most people don't really notice they've got the sickness, but some people end up really sick in hospital. And if we could just get a warning sign that they were going to go down that path, we'd be able to treat them quicker. The final part is that all of the doctors and scientists contribute to research, and there are full-time researchers who are trying to answer all the questions we've got about this virus. Why does it make us so sick? Why aren't we able to fight it off? Or why are only some people able to fight it off? What happens in children? How do they fight it off in a really effective way? And some questions we won't be able to answer for years because we don't understand. Does this virus like winter or do worse in winter? There's so many questions we don't know yet.
Now, one question that is, I think, might be a bit tougher, it goes back to a point you were saying just a little while ago in how this virus interacts with different people. So someone might have it and not really realise that they've got it. They've just got a little bit of a cough, but generally they feel fine. Other people, it really does them some damage. They're in bed for weeks. Maybe they have to go to hospital. They have real trouble breathing. At the moment, as a clinical scientist, why are people dealing with this differently? What's going on in our bodies?
I think we don't have as many answers as we would like to at the moment. We have some idea of, we know that if some people already have a problem with their lungs, particularly older people who have got a lifetime of breathing dangerous things in, have got particular conditions, we know they do worse. It's just harder, their lungs are more fragile. But there's a lot that's probably going on to do with exactly what a person's immune system is like. That it's how the virus interacts with our immune system and what that triggers, what kind of response it triggers in some people, and everyone's different. It's really hard to figure out exactly why some people do so much worse than others.
Now, it's a lot of work to become a doctor. Why did you want to do it, and why did you also want to specialise as a clinical scientist and look into pathology more?
So I've always had an interest in science. That's just my natural, when I was studying all my subjects at school, I liked the sciences, and I have to confess I did like maths. But then I explored there's all sorts of different ways of doing science as a career, whether it's sort of media and telling stories about science, all the way through to being in the lab at the bench doing experiments. And I started off being a researcher. But actually, what I enjoy most about the job I've ended up in, the clinical scientist job, is that I'm so closely involved in figuring out what's wrong with patients. Every day is different because we get hundreds to thousands of samples in the lab every day, and we have a lot of tests that we do, the same tests every day, but every patient is different. And so you're looking at those results, and I like the fact that the results that I'm reporting out as the consultant, I am answering questions for that patient, helping the doctors figure out what's wrong with that person, what treatment they need. And a lot of my job is actually on the phone to the doctors, talking through some tricky results, trying to figure out what's going on in this patient. So it's a mixture of problem solving and being helpful, and I like both of those things.
Amazing. Dr. Rachel Wheeler, thank you so much for coming on the show. Right, let's get some good COVID news in this week's Science in the News. A new treatment called Regeneron, REGN-CoV2, it's being developed right now. It's an antibody cocktail, and it's thought that President Trump was given this sort of treatment to help him recover when he contracted the disease. Also, you might have already had COVID-19 and not even known you had it because many cases are asymptomatic, which means that you don't get any of the symptoms. But it's also all the more reason to stick to the rules about social distancing and washing your hands, because it's still possible that the virus can be transmitted to others when you're asymptomatic who might be more seriously affected. And finally, here's some good news. The European Union regulators have begun the process to approve one of the first vaccines created here in the UK, and it's known as the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. It's one of 11 vaccines worldwide in the later stages of development, which means hopefully they're close to finishing, which means that hopefully there's a really good chance as well that we will see vaccines become available in the coming year. Now, you just heard that hopefully we'll get a vaccine for COVID-19 fairly soon. There are many teams across the world racing to find one that is safe, that's effective. But what actually are vaccinations? Professor Hallex and Nurse Nanobot, two of our faves, they're here to tell us more.
Professor Hallex's Kaleidoscope Antibiotic.
Oh, I don't feel well. I think I've got an infection. Nurse Nanobot? Computer?
The human body is full of microbes, tiny living organisms that are found pretty much everywhere on Earth. There are 5 main types of microbes, with 3 of the most common being viruses, like the common cold, bacteria that can cause pneumonia, and fungi that can cause athlete's foot. Most microbes cause no harm to the body, and many help keep you alive, so it's important to look after them. Some, though, can be harmful and cause infections.
Ooh, Professor, use a tissue. Tissues help to stop harmful microbes from spreading. I'll tell you what, why don't I give you a checkup? I could take a look inside your body to see what's going on. 1 minute, I'll charge up the Heli-Telly bubble.
My amazing invention that can shrink us to the size of an atom. 50 nanometers should do it, Nanobot. That's 1,500 times smaller than a human hair is wide. Bon voyage!
Heli-Telly bubble ready for launch in 3, 2, 1.
Engaging thrusters. Microbes detected. Setting bearings. Entering your mouth. Gosh, it's crowded in here. Looks like the sensors picked up a beautiful Streptococcus. This microbe is a type of bacteria. They are single-cell organisms which often grow in communities. They look like chains, and if I try to touch one, they're very slippery. Streptococci are responsible for a large majority of problems in the mouth, from throat infections to tooth decay. And as well as streptococci, there's lots of other different types of bacteria. In fact, there's so many, the computer can't keep up.
Staphylococcus, Prevotella, Bacteroides.
The number's gone off the scale. There's millions of bacteria in here. It's probably because bacteria like the sugar you eat.
Excuse me? Mine's quite a clean mouth, I'll have you know. I brush my teeth twice a day. If I didn't clean them regularly, I could have as many as 1 billion bacteria hanging around on just one tooth.
Ew!
Come on, Nanobot! You know that, like many microbes, most bacteria are nothing to worry about. Most are entirely harmless, and some are even extremely useful to us.
Lactobacillus helps turn milk into yogurt and helps food to be digested, whilst Bacteroides help bodies make important vitamins.
Well, even though it's bacteria central in here, it's all looking pretty normal. I don't think the Streptococcus is making you feel poorly because there isn't much sugar around here.
Microbe detected.
Just taking a detour into the nose. Oh yes, I can see a whole host of different microbes in here, stuck to all the hairs. In fact, they're viruses. The damage they've caused to these cells has made the delicate skin very irritated and sore. This could be the reason you're feeling rotten. This gang are called rhinovirus. They cause the common cold. Each individual virus looks like a bubbly ball, and they're very small indeed, only 30 nanometers wide. You could fit over 30,000 of them on a full stop. I'll take an image for the data bank.
It says here that there
There's over 200 types of rhinovirus, which is probably why the common cold is, well, so common.
Virus comes from a Latin word which means slimy liquid or poison.
Ha! Well, I can understand why with all that snot they produce. But viruses can't reproduce without using cell material from other living things. And that can cause damage in the process, which is what causes the unpleasant symptoms. But how do we know it's a virus, Nanobot? After all, there's lots of different types of microbe.
Well, viruses are some of the very smallest microbes, so size is a clue. We can also tell by the way they reproduce. This one has invaded a cell and is forcing it to create thousands of copies of the virus. That's how viruses reproduce. And given the number of cells they've invaded, I think I've found your infection.
Good work, Nanobot. Time to head home. Set the heli-telly-bubble coordinates for the lab. Achoo!
Professor Hallux's Kaleidoscope Antibiotic, with support from eBug and Public Health England. Find out more at funkidslive.com/Hallux or visit e-bug.eu.
That's almost it for this week's Fun Kids Science Weekly. Before we go, a very quick reminder that you need to stay safe at the moment. It's likely that COVID-19 will be with us for a little while yet, but you already know what you need to do to keep yourself and your friends and your family as safe as you can. You know it. You've been told it for like the last year. You need to wash your hands, don't touch your face, stick to the rules when it comes to being in places with other people. Hands, face, space. The great thing about science, and why we love finding out scientific things here on the show and at Fun Kids, is that scientists, including pathologists, they're helping us to learn more about the virus, and every week we're unpicking more of the puzzles of this pandemic. And that is it for this week's Fun Kids Science Weekly. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a pandemic pathology special with support from the Royal College of Pathologists. You can find out more at funkidslive.com/pathology. We'll be back with more of your questions next week. If you've got something sciencey that you want answered on the show, you need to leave it for me as a review over on Apple Podcasts. While you're there, it's one of the best places that you can hear all of our amazing science series. You've heard some today. We've got loads more there on Spotify, wherever you get your shows, and at funkidslive.com. And Fun Kids are a children's radio station from the UK. You can hear us on your DAB digital radio, on that free Fun Kids app, and at funkidslive.com.